Hello and welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for this show. And this is where we dig into those difficult topics that are happening in our day, right before our eyes. And we do this to educate ourselves in order to have those conversations with the people around us, conversations that count, conversations with an eternal perspective. Today, I have someone, she's a woman after my own heart. She is an education policy expert and family protection specialist. Her name is Anne Craft Tydus. She's unapologetic, constitutional, conservative. Yay. Anne Craft Tydus is the co-founder of Virginians for Children First, and most recently, the founder of the action arm of VAFCF, Parent Team 6, dedicated to unifying child protection, education, and constitutional advocacy groups across the Commonwealth. And I hope that her studies and digging in also affect across the United States. But we all have to start somewhere, and that is locally. She's a graduate of Virginia Polytech Institute and State University, where she majored in both electronic print journalism and geopolitical war history of the 20th century. She has spent the last 3 years between 2021 and 2024, I will ask her if that is correct, traveling the state, speaking to political, community, and parent groups, and exposing the root issues of education, such as the design of government schooling, rooted in humanism and behaviorism. There is a war raging against the family where our children are being used as the weapons being implemented by global agencies, an unconstitutional federal Department of Education, and the administrative state of unelected bureaucrats running our education system. She is dedicated to action, accountability, and creating long-term change in the Commonwealth of Virginia so that all children can live in a world where their God-given right to innocence is preserved and protected. Let's welcome Anne to the Faith and Culture Show. Hi, Anne. Thank you. You just picked up your children from carpool, brought them home, then you're off to dance. But welcome. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking some time out today to talk about this super important issue.
Thank you so much for having me. Whenever I receive these phone calls, it's always a blessing, God stepping in for people hearing what's going on. Because like you said, it is correct. I have only been doing this. I went to my first school board meeting August 10th of 2021. I had a 6th grader who had just gone back after COVID, and I had a 2-year-old. So I went to it was the meeting where Chesterfield had fully adopted the transgender policy and masked our children. In under 4 minutes, voted on those 2 issues after hours of public comment. And I'm like, as a researcher, having, a journalism degree, it didn't make sense. And I'm one of those people where I had to make it make sense. And I've been pulling that thread for the last 3.5 years. And I'm just unapologetic. Like you said, like the knowledge that I have, I can't keep it.
Right.
And, and sometimes I end up like, people think I'm combating like the right or and I should be focused more on the left. But when you know the truth about education and the failure of two parties and an uneducated nation about the history of American education, you have to, I travel, running a nonprofit. And if it's I tell people when the bat signal goes up, I do everything to show up because it's a calling. Like I tell people all the time, I wake up every day and God sends me and I don't think twice about it. I know this is what I was put here to do and understand, like other people may not quite understand, and think about things in a way that I can then reiterate to other people to get them to process things that we've just kind of all accepted. Because until 40, I had 2 children. I had never thought about these things before.
Mm-hmm. That's right. And sadly, a lot of teachers that belong to unions and different teachers associations, they really, it's almost as if they worship the Department of Education.
And that's very true. The school has, and this has been the plan from the beginning, is the school has replaced the church. And it is a worship. Is that you're sending your child to do something that the church and the community used to do, and you're fully reliant on it, we think that without a Department of Education that children would just walk around and walk into walls, or they would be illiterate or be, and the fact is that before government education, it was like almost 100% literacy. 90% of children were being sent to school paying tuition. This is back in the colonial days. And the 10% who were impoverished were being sent by charitable organizations. And at where we are now is that you have to think and process. And I can give people the pieces all day long, but you have to think, how did we get here? And that's, as somebody with a master's degree in geopolitical war history of the 20th century, history is my thing. And understanding the full history of American education is what I tell people every single day. You have to understand and process. Because when you understand where our children now compared to where, if you think about the founding fathers, there was no public government education back then. These men had learned at home. They had learned, some of them went to common schools, some of them went to private schools, some of them were homeschooled, but none of them relied on the government to be educated. And with the amazing documents that these men were able to produce then, if you read how literate these men were. Ben Franklin had like 2 years of actual education. Shakespeare did not have government education. All of these brilliant people, 2000 BC is when we had the written language, and where we are now. And you can't help but deduce and look, and common sense will tell you that the 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, 300 days a year captured environment you're sending your children into is why, and it's not parents, it's not children are suddenly mentally ill. And I get very passionate about it because once you have that common sense switch, if you still have the capability of having it turns on, you can't look away from it.
Yeah, and I became aware of this when my children were young, and it's funny because if you're a mother involved and you see, mine was more of a moral issue because our children went to one of the private, I guess, elite
yes,
college
my
preparatory.
parents lived down the street.
Right. Okay.
It's crazy expensive, and it's very elitist.
And it's, yes. And it is, they operate under a Christian banner, or they used to. And God started opening my eyes, and I was sitting there thinking, this is not okay with God, because as you know, they've become, social factories. What am I trying to say?
I would say that
social ideologies.
They are worse at what they're implementing as a Catholic private school than Fairfax. I would say they are almost the equivalent of what's accepted there, as like people think of Fairfax, but it's really every school division. But the one you hear the most about being Fairfax is, I would say that if you paid attention, is that whatever's going on in Fairfax is going on inside those Catholic schools.
Right. And this wasn't Catholic. This was Episcopalian, which is probably worse. And
I went to Episcopal elementary school, K through 5, before I went to public school. And I'm right down the street from one that is absolutely horrendous. What they're doing is the equivalent of what I'm like. I ask parents, why are you paying to send them there? Like, you could send them to government schools and get, if you love this social liberal radical stuff, they could get that and you don't pay anything.
Yeah, it's free. It's free. Yeah, social engineering is what I was trying to say, because that's what they've become. And that's when I started diving deeply into, well, first it was the moral issues and biblical issues, to the point where finally, after years of the squeaky wheel, they changed their website to, instead of Christian identity, a Episcopal identity.
Right.
So, I mean, God does with us what he can, and then we move on. When both children graduated, then it was, thank goodness, I wiped the dust off my shoes and moved on. But it did make me research, how did we get to where we are today? And that's what you're going to talk to us about. Right. And I want the audience to know, this is the first in several conversations we're going to have about this, because there's just so much, we can't cover it in one show. Right. So Anne's been super, super nice to want to come back several times. So let's get the foundation built here. It's like, what happened? Like you said, the founders, they didn't have all of this government involvement in their education. And parents took a lot more, I guess they were responsible for getting their children educated. Where now it's like, drop them off, thank goodness, wipe their hands.
It's a nanny state is what they call it. Because I had to, my husband had been deployed. He's a former Marine or prior service Marine Corps. Then he was at the Iraqi embassy, and I don't work. And not only am I a proud stay-at-home mom, which is something that really society has gotten away from, which started the whole feminism thing, is that women have to be equal and women have to have jobs. That's part of this entire equation that people don't realize has been so systemically embedded and is part of the plan, is that, getting a woman out of the house is part of separating the family, making them reliant on the government, because it went from K through 12 to pre-K through 12. And now we live in a state where birth thrive to 5 under the current administration is what we have both sides of the political aisle applauding. And all I can hear is Karl Marx saying, from the time a mother is away from, a child can be away from her mom, essentially off of the breast, then they belong to the state. The difference is, Karl Marx said, at the state's expense, but we live in a world where it's at our own expense because our tax dollars pay for this. The government is not paying for this. And that's what most people miss out on, is the government pays for nothing. So
we're the government. And that's a big, people forget that politicians we elect work for us. We do not work for them. We are the government.
Right.
But we have been convinced over the years.
They derive their power from us.
Yes.
When I go down, because I live so close to Richmond, whether it's a pandemic preparedness committee we battle still, is that I am the most, people started calling me the founding mother, because I remind them that as duty-bearing civil servants, and that they do not like being called civil servants, but that is what you are.
That's what they are.
Correct. Is that you answer and you derive your power from your constituents. And it doesn't matter whether you're the left or the right. And I really realized this in 2.5 years, even after I pulled my children, going to every month religiously to school board meetings, is that they do not care what their constituents, even teachers unions were telling them how they were misspending. It's the facade and that's really what we have to understand. And then it comes into no taxation without representation. And we're almost back. If you go reread the Declaration of Independence, you could be like, #, yep, we're really back at that point, is that we elect people to be our representatives, and they go to Richmond or Washington to speak for their constituents who elected them, and they all must abide by the Constitution and everything outside of that. And so what we live in today, I explain to people, is that we've all been educated. So even though I received a good education, I'm extremely literate, I went on to academia, but our morals at 40, I was born in 80, so in the 90s, is that we were not taught civics or any kind of government in order to become productive, free Americans. So it's hard to explain to my generation when they're already in that mindset of not knowing how to be free, how to then free their children. When I tell them public education in its own right is socialism. Yeah. And so when I talk about you can't fix it, it has to be dismantled, and then you don't rely on the government, they look and they're like, well, what do we do with our own kids? And I'm like, they're your children. You figure it out. My husband came home. We didn't have any money. We live. But my job in life as a mother is to protect my children at all costs. And if that means that we have to sell our nice car, get rid of our gym membership, not go to Starbucks, live paycheck to paycheck, not have retirement, to make sure that they're not in government education, then every parent, I believe, would, once they got to or heard what they were being taught, should have a little light bulb go off to say, we have to get them out.
Yeah. They really knew what was going on and the underpinnings. So where do you want to start with how this began to get corrupted?
I would say it didn't begin to, that's the best part, is to start, is that you can't fix something it's not broken. It's doing exactly what it was designed to do. So you cannot reform. There's no way to fix government education that was designed by first Unitarians. Harvard became Unitarian. And so these are people, they were moved, God was no longer the center of everything. Man was the center. Man was the God, which then, turned to, you can Hegel, you get into Marxism and all that stuff. But really here in the United States it was Unitarianism. So Calvinism versus Unitarians. And the father of socialism actually developed socialism, Owenism, in New Harmony, Indiana. He's the British father of socialism, Robert Owen. And he had this utopian collective society. And so essentially before socialism even had a name, when you think of collectivism, Nazism, socialism, fascism, communism, is that there's the little differences between them, but the number one connector is collectivism. Ayn Rand said that. That's the evil of it. So if you don't know what the difference between those four is when the stripping of a child's individuality, their identity in government schooling is the first thing that starts to happen. And this was the plan all along, is when his utopian society, this was before Horace, probably 30, 40 years before Horace Mann. So early 1800s, he had come over from Wales, from Britain. And he said, my utopian society failed because we didn't start young enough, and it wasn't all of them. Talking about the adults were not indoctrinated enough. They had not started them young enough, and all of them did not have, they loved what he was doing, but they hadn't started young enough. And so he actually started to develop and reach out to Prussia. And if you read his biography, he says that the Prussian model, which is what everybody knows, or most people, when you talk about government education, if you think there's a problem with it, you know Horace Mann, and you've heard of the Prussian model of education. And it was actually, we didn't adopt the Prussian technically, is that Prussia got it from us. And then we went back 40 years later after they had developed this compulsory manufacturing style of compulsory education to make children uniform. It's not to benefit children. You know, I recently wrote an article called A Fool's Errand, and that's what we're on by trying to reform something that's doing exactly what it was designed to do, which was divide a nation, destroy children, and separate them from their families. And every totalitarian government, whether you're talking about Russia, Germany, you know, China, whoever who has had a totalitarian dictator has praised their government school system. And by us still buying into this idea that it can be reformed, we've put ourselves in a position where the ability to replicate an American experiment, which is what it's called, you know, a constitutional republic, is that we can, my generation can, I can barely explain it to them, is that the ability to keep it going at the, it's almost dead, is that if we don't understand this and why it was designed, and that it's not failing, and that's what I tell people all the time, is that people that understand this, they know that it is thriving. It is doing exactly what it was designed to do. And that's how you get an entire generation of children across the entire nation to act the same exact way. What I call them feral, but if they're not mentally ill, it's so many things wrapped up into one. But blaming parents and blaming children is the last thing that we should be doing. Yeah. Is that everybody has to, you know, start understanding the origins.
Yeah, there was a senator out west, I believe, in the 80s, and I think he was from Utah, and I would like to say that for sure, but I'm not sure. It's the 80s. He was on Good Morning America, and he clearly stated on that show, he said, if we cannot get Christian children away from their parents, 20 years from now, they are not going to fit in.
Right. So, I mean, there's so much documentation as a researcher. You can go back in like congressional records, and I'm happy to send you, if you, we can put whatever you want on your, but is that there's so much congressional record that going back, like McCarthy was 100% on the nose about what was going on. So the whole, you know, we grew up thinking about McCarthy and this, you know, Red Scare and how terrible he was. No, he was on it. He was exactly, like, you can read books like Bella V. Dodd's School of Darkness is a good one if you want to understand the infiltration of communism into the church. Is how, and it's a full memoir she wrote because she ended up being accepted and returning her life back to Christianity. But I mean, these people will tell you exactly how they got in the streets of New York City, these like cells, and how and what they did and their plan and how they infiltrated, you know, the churches, how they infiltrate. So when people think about, like, if you've ever heard of the term the long march through the institution, like,
oh yes, is
that people automatically, you know, think of education. It's all institutions. If you look at the legal now, doctors, but really to understand is when we talked about Unitarianism, like, is that it ended up being humanists, and secular humanism has become, but really it's humanism with a capital H is how the churches got involved, because little h humanism, of course, has a love of, you know, humanity and human, but humanism with a capital H is man-centered, and it is a religion. And on that chronology that I did for Virginia Christian Alliance, the same, I believe it was within a year that they took the Bible out of school, the Supreme Court ruled that humanism was a religion. And that's going forward. If we really want to fight this, that's going to be extremely important, because every single thing government schooling was founded on was by humanists.
Yeah.
So the establishment clause comes in, and I like to think of like root solutions, like not just playing whack. I played whack-a-mole with legislation and all that for 2 years, and then I got to like really big root solutions. But all these people, and so I've had to reinvent the wheel so many times, is number one thing I ask people now is, how do you destroy a nation? And because people have to understand how short of a time we've been here, Western society,
yeah.
and it's really, I tell people when they want to talk about like white privilege, is the privilege of this country is having been born free. And that's our privilege. And so anybody like G. Van Fleet, or people who have fled, Venezuela or China or Cambodia, or anybody that's come here from a different country that is outspoken about what's going on here, is that our privilege is that we have been born free. We don't know what it's like to not be free.
Yeah.
And that's the privilege and that's what we're flushing away for our children.
And that they are the first ones I've noticed when I hear them speak. They are the first ones who will tell you what's going on here. They will tell you, no, what's happening here is very dangerous because it happened in their country. And they'll tell you, and you're right. We have gotten so used to just being free, or we think we're free. Okay, right. There's an illusion. We could make an argument for that, but we're going to focus on education today.
Well, I'm free. Like I tell people, I had somebody tell me that my existence is an act of rebellion, because once you understand free, like I had somebody, a really good friend of mine, a really close, like say, well, we're not as free as we used to be. And I was like, yes, we are. Is that the mentality of not understanding our inalienable rights is extremely, is that nobody's restricted my free speech. You've restricted that yourself. And that goes back to politically correct. People don't understand that being PC was a huge part of this plan. It
was horrible. And all the changing of the words. When I think of Anne right away, is I think of taxes. It's unconstitutional.
Correct. Absolutely.
And so like we talked about, all of this is being paid for by our taxes. Do we have a choice? Yeah, we cannot pay, but then we have the mafia, the federal mafia coming after us. And in order to just say, forget it, it's not worth it. We need to move on. That's what I mean by free. It's not what the founders had intended, and it's gotten way out of control.
Right. So, and it's like, do I think that we will ever be able to restore the founding fathers' vision of freedom? No, because we have let the bureaucracy, people think the administrative state I talked about in my bio that you read these are the non-elected people, like the school board association, the education, but these are the people that it's just a group, or whether it's the World Economic Forum or the UN, it's like, global or local, is your school board goes and they ask the VSBA what to do. They're not elected, and they're not telling school boards how to follow the Constitution or the Code of Virginia. And they'll tell them you don't. And so these are the people telling our elected officials, and it goes to all levels. Like, it doesn't matter, whether it's the bar, the American Historical, the Historical Association, the ABA, psychologists, the Medical Association, anything with association in it, it's compromised. And that's who's telling doctors what to do, or that not the Code of Virginia or the Nuremberg Code or the, Constitution of the United States. It's this non-elected, mysterious body that everybody who's supposed to answer to their patients or their students or their parents or us free people, that's who's telling these people what to do. And it's got, it's like, I know ways to rein it in, but it's almost like it's going to be kind of revolutionary, but it has to be. Crossing the Rubicon comes to mind a lot. But, you know, part of my story, I've been clean for 16 years. And when I was in the rooms, you know, getting clean, if one of my favorite terms, if you want something you've never had, you have to do something you've never done. And that we're going to have a complete mind shift in order to accomplish this freedom for our country, our children, our grandchildren. That's what it's going to take. And people have to kind of like wrap their heads around, because everybody seems to understand like that COVID, Fauci, like the manipulation of, you know, the new world order, if you want to call it, in every aspect. They'll have conversations with you about election integrity, you know, medical freedom, but you get to education and it's like a grinding halt. And it baffles me sometimes, where I'm like, how do you fully understand how compromised this nation is? But when you think about how it got that way, or what's the easiest way to do it, you put all children in a captured environment, you remove God, and then further into the history, you make them the most illiterate, mentally unstable children that have ever existed in human history. And then they become what? Slaves. And that's what our children are. And that's exactly how it was planned to be, is that everybody can talk about, you know, whether it's Fauci or the border or whatever anybody can, be passionate about, but you get to government schooling where you're sending your tiniest, most innocent human beings. And it's all of a sudden the conspiracy of it all. It's like too much to process, you know, sometimes is how I feel.
I like the way you said, because I never thought of it that way, as it was designed to be this way. Mm-hmm. So it's not failing, it's not falling apart. And I think thinking of it this way, that it's doing exactly what it was designed for. You're correct, absolutely. And they're probably like salivating at this point, because they have an entire generation. I mean, your generation is all brainwashed.
My generation is really what I came to understand is, especially when it comes to the mental health stuff. You know, these people can't teach your children to read, but now you're going to rely on them to give them mental health. Is like kind of like where my brain goes, what? These people can't even teach. Like, we have 45 million functionally literate, like the amount, which means that they can't read over a 5th grade level. That's like the high point of, we can get children out of like government schooling at 12th grade functionally illiterate. That's like or basic in scoring. But now they're telling you your children are now mentally ill, and you're going to rely on these same people to make your children mentally better. It's just, especially when it comes to people who claim to be right of center, is I'm like, when did you accept we're the government, we're here to save you was a good thing?
Yeah. And what would you tell? Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself and our conversation. So do you want me to show that, like, the progression right now, or do you want to wait for next time?
Well, let me see if I can present. I broke it up and to make it easier read. I broke it up by line. So if I think,
do I need to post it, or can you?
I think you can allow me to share it, or you can share it. Either way.
Okay, I see it, and yeah, let's see. There we go.
There we go. So this chronology, I've been blessed to have been embraced by Don Blake and Judeo-Christian Alliance, and I have an office space there, and we've built a library. So last year, because they have the project, why am I 1607, about the first landing project.
Right.
And because most people don't know that even before Jamestown, at Cape Henry, there's so much history that people don't tell you about, was really 13 years before the Pilgrims is where.
But you really have to wonder why this is what happened. And I think it's because of what, how they fasted and prayed before they even stepped foot.
They don't want people to know that they carried the first charter, which is extremely important, because the pulling of the first charter, when Charles II revoked that, is the fight between Protestant, what was going on in England with, you think about, Henry VIII, and everybody knows, about, Catholicism, and then, how Protestantism came about, is that was a huge part of this, and how that time frame is that's why they don't want you to know, is because these people literally had the Virginia Charter when they landed at Cape Henry, and they got off and they prayed. They had the very first body of government voting there on those sand dunes. Is that when you can look up how long has Virginia legislation history. They'll tell you that we have the longest, going back to that exact date. Is there, as the mother of states and statesmen living in Virginia, it's almost offensive every day how un-American Virginians are. It's just and then once you understand the history of the state, you have to want to save it. Mm-hmm. But so Appeal to Heaven was the second event. That they had the first event last year down in Virginia Beach, and this year it was actually in the governor's office down in Richmond. And it was the Appeal to Heaven was the second event. And John Blake had said, "Can you do a chronology for me of education?" And my brain is like all of it on one page. And so it's whenever I have all this knowledge in my brain, people call it a central processing unit. But so when people ask me to do things or give me assignments, it's a wonderful challenge, or it helps me do better work. Yeah. So I sat and I went all the way back. And so from the 1600s, we're talking about landing all the way, Revolutionary War into 50 years after the Revolutionary War. It was homeschooling, and independent churches were solely responsible for education. Tax-funded government schools and education without the Bible and God were inconceivable. And at the time of the American Revolution, literacy was virtually 100%. And this was, like I said, is that this was just people teaching at home, or they're, up in New England, they had started some common schools. But the only, Pennsylvania had a law, but the law said that there had to be schools, but you could teach them however you wanted. But is that 90% of children were paying tuition if they were going to private schools, and the 10% that were poor or underprivileged, as we call them now, is that there were charitable organizations from the churches paying for the poor without the state helping at all. Is that we are fully, we came here without technology, without cars, without anything. You think of evolution, we're supposed to go so much further, but is that not only stagnation that government education has done to our children, but it's de-evolution of the amount of brain processing our children should be able to do now 300 years later. And then it just kind of, without getting, I couldn't get into the whole, we just talked about with charter being pulled, and you could get into how Harvard started as extremely religious, and then immediately the Unitarians took Harvard over, which that their theologian school from the 1600s, almost 20 years after Harvard started, their theologian school started Unitarianism. And so, talking about that's a whole different section, but really, but I'm lucky enough that working at Judeo-Christian, McGuffey readers, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but I'm lucky enough to, they're the ones that you open up, and it taught children how to read.
Hmm.
Because if you think about it, children, by the time they go to school, they have taught themselves to speak. My daughter had taught herself to read by the time she was 3. They know 1,000 words at a minimum.
Mm-hmm.
And then they've taught themselves all these amazing things. How do we as a society say all of a sudden, when we send them these little amazing creative creatures that that just want to learn and thrive, but all of a sudden you send them somewhere and these amazing that you didn't teach them to speak, they learn on their own just by watching and observing and mimicking. How do we think that we send them now to the government and they stop being these amazing self-teaching, like, how do we, and these are things I never thought about, but once I did, I was like, I have to make that make sense, and I have to go find it out. But so the McGuffey readers, it's like, if you think about actual phonics, is what we've gotten away from, extremely far away from. Even this, this idea of history of reading is not correct. So 122 million copies over 75 years. It was intensive systemic phonics. Like, there's only 44 sounds in our alphabet, and we've had an alphabet since 2000 BC. And so you think about, why would you change that? And it's really like, it starts to make you think about all the different ways that they're now saying that children have to read. It's like, how much do we have to fail them before we just go back to the way it used to be?
I think that's up to us, but this is all part of it, right?
Yeah.
Waking people up to the reality. And we're sending our children to, like you said, government institutions. They have to stand in a straight line. They have to be uniform. They have to, do, and raising hand is okay and all that. But think of it to me, it's like Marxism, and I understand.
It is. And one is that we all were raised, like, I went to public school, there was a bell. Like, if the teacher was in the middle of talking or you were in the middle of doing, you stopped what you were doing. But it wasn't. And so that's why it's those of us that came out, my generation, we can't process how bad it is, because parents don't take the time, since children are now on Chromebooks. They don't have papers to look at. They don't have textbooks to look at. They don't even take the time to see what their children are actually learning. And I challenge parents to get a portal, and you don't even have to FOIA it or do anything. And you can go in, whether it's Canvas or Schoology, look at your child, especially their health. Look at their modules, start reading their assignments that you can get a portal to. Because if you're a parent and you're sending your child into government schooling now that there's no books or you have no papers to look at, and they're teaching kindergartners to read on computer screens, and you're just trusting that process, you have to start thinking about that too. Like, how you've just been trained to, all of a sudden computers are the new thing, therefore I don't have to look at papers. And then you just start trusting more when it should be actually kind of the opposite. Yeah. But, I'm a huge law, like common law, American jurisprudence, what the Supreme Court says. And so, Supreme Court cases are really big. And so the Vidal-Girard's executor, the U.S. Supreme Court decision ruled against a Philadelphia school that decided to teach morality, but not Christianity. That was in 1844. And the Supreme Court justice said, why may not the Bible, and especially the New Testament, where can the purest principles of morality be learned so clearly and so perfectly as from the New Testament? And so that was in 1844. And then it gets really crazy, like in between that, the 50 years in between there is when you have John Dewey. Everybody probably knows John. He is the god of the liberal left, which is crazy when people talk about the white supremacy and white privilege of this nation being founded on whiteness. Is that if you are not white and you are an educator talking, the people that they are praising are white men. Yes. They're all white men. So John Dewey, Thorndike, all these people that have designed this crazy public education are white men. And so it's like, this is one of those things. They know not to come after me anymore because they're still white. It's just not Christian white. It's just not constitutional white. And that's the difference, is that all of this was designed by white men. Yes. So where's the white privilege in that? And then the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, it's not a conspiracy theory, is that they found it. I mean, their money is still, you read documents coming from the global level and the national level that have Carnegie, Rockefeller stamped all over it. But Columbia, Oregon, so you have to think like Columbia University, Teachers College, and there's 3 big ones. And they all learn from a man called Wilhelm Wundt. And Wilhelm Wundt, Leipzig, way across the ocean, is that there's a great book called The Leipzig Connection. The University of Leipzig, Wilhelm Wundt. Almost every educator, back in the 1800s, so Columbia University, Johns Hopkins, and Chicago, the 3 main founding teachers' colleges. Columbia University and Teaching College, funded by the Carnegies and the Rockefellers, they started not just the teachers, the educators, educated strictly in humanism. They're all humanists. So and also the behavioral psychologists. Yeah. And so we're talking about the right. People think psychology's been around forever. It hasn't. Is that the people who designed government schooling in the United States of America were humanist psychologists, behaviorists. Yes. So our children are being trained like animals. So
Alfred Kinsey was the one who developed our sex education, and he was a zoologist.
Not just that, but Alfred Kinsey, and this is one thing I've been talking to high up, because the book problem, the pornography, is that 43 states in the 60s and 70s adopted, if you read the obscenity code in your state, they're called exemptions, where it says, nothing in this section shall be construed to apply to tax-funded schools, libraries. So why in the world would you, and in Virginia, it was in 1973 is when this exemption was added. And so I started digging, and I found out that because of Alfred Kinsey's book on boys and girls from the 40s and 50s, these exemptions were added, called the Model Penal Code. And so now that we're 100 years later, 50, 80 years later, that we know who Alfred Kinsey was. He gave babies orgasms. He was a child molester.
Yep.
Is that you go after the Model Penal Code and you remove that, the exemptions go away, and obscenity is not protected free speech. The books are gone. And so Kinsey's one is that all of these, every single part of government schooling, so comprehensive sexuality education, that started with something that we just accept now, family life or sex ed. That's actually called values clarification. Drug ed, death ed, all this stuff that my generation grew up thinking was normal was designed to teach values differently, or before your family has gotten to the point to discuss it with a child, the school is going to intervene and do it for you.
Yes, and they're going to do it the humanist way.
Right.
We do have to wrap it up now that we're getting into the juicy stuff.
Yeah, this is a great setup, now that we've gotten that.
Yes.
It was designed to do exactly what it's doing.
Yes.
We were
where can people find your work, Anne?
Like the VirginiansForChildrenFirst.org.
Okay.
A short version is VAFCF.org. Parent or PT6 PTSIX.org is our action arm. You can find me just put my name in. I'm extremely public. And I travel. I'm in Chesterfield, but I was just up in Loudoun speaking at their GOP. I'm going to be, I was just in Virginia Beach. That's what I do is, you can reach me. through you or vp.va for children first at gmail.com. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me anywhere if you have questions. But I think you have and you're more than welcome to put my contact information up on your site.
I will.
And I love talking to people who want to understand this, because people who can wrap their head around that everything that pretty much we've ever been taught is not true in order to save our children in the Republic. Anybody that can grasp that idea and want to learn and, like you said, hit the ground and do something about it, yes, I will talk to those people all day long. And
Christians should be the first in line.
Absolutely.
Because this is a big deal. And thank you again. I'm so excited. I'm sorry, what?
This is a God. I mean, those of us that we're doing God's work, is that, God, the first word, is that the word is so important, and the word is God. And it, in John, like, people forget, is that I tell Christians all the time, when you start talking about God and loving God, and it's like, we've been trained not to do that, is that it's very freeing, and it's part of the whole, like, liberation process of your soul so that you can fight.
We have so much more to cover. So I don't want anyone to miss all these shows. Just be patient. They're all going to go up, as soon as we have our meetings and are able to record. And this should give you a lot of ammunition. And you can also go to the websites that Anne just mentioned, and we will have her back soon.
Yeah. Well, next time we'll get into Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and how Lenin and the Bolsheviks, with their part in all of this, and Lenin's world plan for domination, and how that's succeeding exactly as planned right now.
Okay. Awesome.
All right. Thank you.
So much. Thank you.